Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I want to share some of the classics that I'm hoping to get to in 2021. So I have a list of 12 classics that I'm hoping to read in 2021. They're in no particular order, so this isn't like starting in January and moving through the year. This is just 12 classics that have been on my TBR for a while and that I'm hoping to finally tackle in 2021. A lot of them are what I think would be classified as tomes, so they have been put off because they're a little bit intimidating, and I'm hoping that this will be the year to finally mark them off my TBR. So without further ado, I'll start with what is probably the most intimidating book on my list, and that is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And as we all know, this book is absolutely giant, which is why it's taken me literally forever to get to it. I picked up this edition when I was in Paris last February, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. Like, the cover art is stunning. We have these gorgeous flap designs. And it's a newer translation by Christine Donahuer. And when I looked into the various translations, this is quite a new translation, and it was listed as being one of the more accessible translations compared to previous renditions of this book. So I'm hoping that that will make it a little bit more accessible and easy to get through, because from the size of this, I need all the help I can get. So if this translation is easier to read, I am looking forward to that. I have actually never watched any of the adaptations of Les Miserables. I have seen the play on the West End, I guess 6 or 7 years ago now. And so I really want to get to all of the wonderful film and miniseries adaptations, but I'm holding off until I read this book. So I really want to cross that off and start devouring some of the film content and just be able to say that I have read this, because I feel like this is one of those classics that you just want to have read in your life. So this is going to be my year, 2021. I'm going to figure out a reading schedule that makes this a little bit more manageable, and hopefully I enjoy it. Next on my list is Rebecca, and I think you're going to notice a theme, which is that a lot of these have recent adaptations that I really want to watch, but I want to read the book first, and that's why I'm prioritizing them. Rebecca is one of those books that literally everyone seems to have read, and so many people have recommended to me, and it's also one where I feel like I'm skirting the line constantly and finding out spoilers. Like, I feel like there's a fair bit of cultural references to Rebecca, and a lot of people just assume that everyone knows what happens. So if I want to read this book without being spoiled, I need to read it fast. So that's why I'm hoping to get to Rebecca this year. Continuing on that trend of movie adaptations, the next book that I want to read is Sanditon by Jane Austen. This is one of Jane Austen's uncompleted works that she was working on when she passed away. I think she got about 11 or 12 chapters in, so it's maybe halfway, a third finished. And of course, in the last few years, there's been a movie adaptation that completed it that I really want to watch and have heard good things about, but I don't want to watch without having read the source material. So I'm hoping in Jane Austen July this year that I will finally get to Sanditon. Rounding off the books that I have been inspired to read because I want to watch the miniseries, we have Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. Now, this is kind of recently published to be considered a classic, but I think it's 25 years old now, almost. And I think almost anything Margaret Atwood writes can be considered a Canadian classic, so I'm counting this on my list. This edition is quilt themed, so we've got like a quilt block, and then throughout the book, in various section points, we have like other quilt blocks that I believe tie into the story. And it also has some sections that look like they are kind of written as if they're like fake newspaper clippings or accounts of what was going on. So this book is about a famous murder trial in the mid-1800s in Canada, where a servant girl was accused of murdering I believe both the husband and wife that she was employed by. So this book follows the investigation into her case, and I believe part of the time that she's held awaiting trial and kind of the result of that. And so it's, in a way, it's like a true crime inspired novel, which I think will be really interesting because it is historical fiction, which is one of my favorite genres. The other reason that I'm very interested to get to this is that there is a personal connection for me with this book. Part of it is set in what at the time was called an insane asylum in Kingston, and this asylum was particularly for people who had been found not criminally responsible because of mental health challenges, or were awaiting trial and were believed to have mental health challenges that would maybe result in that verdict. And this asylum, at the time that the book is set, was restricted to people who were going through the criminal justice system. But shortly after this trial occurred, it did open up for a wider audience and became an institution that housed people from the broader community. And one of my ancestors' sisters actually ended up living in this asylum and passing away there. So her story is one that I'm very interested in. She lived in asylums from the time she was about 18 until she died in her late 30s. Originally she was in Toronto, and then after the Kingston institution opened up to house a broader population, she was moved there as that was closer to her family so they could visit more often, I'm assuming. So one of my genealogy research goals for the year is to dig into that more and perhaps order her healthcare records from the Archives of Ontario so that I can find out more about the reasons why her family wasn't able to care for her at home and what resulted in her being institutionalized for 20-30 years of her life. And so I think this book will be very moving for me, knowing that the institution that I'm reading about had a family connection, and that my ancestors likely visited her there, my 2 times great-grandmother and my 3 times great-grandparents. So she was the sister for my 2 times great-grandmother. So I'm sure my 3 times great-grandparents would have visited their daughter while she was living in this institution, and so I'm really interested in kind of getting an inside peek into what conditions were like at the time. I'm assuming it wasn't fantastic, so it might be a bit heartbreaking, but this is a book I've been wanting to get to forever. So 2021 is going to be the year that I finally tackle Alias Grace. On a lighter note, I'm also hoping to get to Pat of Silverbush and Mistress Pat, which is a duology by Lucy Maud Montgomery. If you watched my vintage Lucy Maud Montgomery haul, you'll know that I'm trying to read through more of her standalone works that aren't part of her Anne series, and this one sounds particularly charming and somewhat unique in that it has a intact family unit. So Pat lives with both her parents and has siblings, which is kind of unique, as a lot of Lucy Maud Montgomery's characters are orphans or living with aunts and uncles or whatnot. I think this sounds really sweet. This book in particular takes place during a family reunion at Christmas time, so I think I'm going to get to them next December, probably. And of course, I mean, it's Montgomery, so I know it's going to have lots of incredible scenic writing about Prince Edward Island that will just put me in a little trance for a while I escape off to the Maritimes. So I'm excited to get to Mistress Pat and Pat of Silverbush this year. Another children's classic that I'm hoping to get to in 2021 is I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith. This is another that's been on my TBR for literally ages. This book is set in the 1930s and follows a teenage girl protagonist as her family battles with various challenges, including reduced economic means while living in a castle in the UK. Next up is Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and if you watched my Victober videos this year, you'll know that this is one that I've been trying to get through for a while, and I really need to just get through it. I found that my library has it on audiobook, so I'm hoping that that will be the golden ticket to finally allow me to finish this book, because I really do want to get to some of the others in the series, and I've heard that some of the later books in the series are really worth sticking through this one for. Next up, I have another chunky tome that I'm hoping to get to, and that is Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. So I read Bleak House this year, and after finishing Bleak House, I feel like I can read anything because that book was huge. So the next Dickens that I want to tackle is Little Dorrit. I know that a lot of people that I follow who like Dickens have Little Dorrit as one of their favorites, so I'm very hopeful that it's going to be another enjoyable Dickens read for me. I don't know a ton about it, except that it follows, I'm sure, a large cast of characters because it's Dickens, but I believe one of the main characters is Little Dorrit, who's a young girl whose father is in debtor's prison, so it's going to be sad and gritty, and atmospheric, and I'm sure will put me in the mood for Victober. Next up, I have Gunnar's Daughter by Sigrid Undset. I read Undset's Kristen Lavransdatter trilogy, I guess 2 years ago almost now, and I really want to read more of her writing because Kristen Lavransdatter is now one of my favorite book series, my favorite books of all time. So I'm excited to get to Gunnar's Daughter, which is moving further back in time. So Kristen Lavransdatter was set in medieval era Norway, and this is set in like saga era Norway, so more the Viking era. It's significantly shorter than Kristen Lavransdatter. It's just a one-part story, and so I'm really looking forward to diving back into Undset's world. If it's anything like Kristen Lavransdatter, it's going to be a very all-encompassing story that just sweeps me away from the first pages. I'm a little apprehensive because it's an older translation. It's not as famous as the Kristen series, so it has an older translation that I'm hoping will not ruin my enjoyment. Next up on the classics I want to read in 2021 is The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Eventually I would really like to have read all of Shakespeare's work, so I figure it's time that I read another one of his plays. This is one that I never studied at school and have never seen an adaptation of, so I'm going in somewhat blind, although I know it deals with, I believe, a Jewish protagonist living in Venice, so that sounds like it will be very interesting. I also have somewhere here... I also have here The Midwife of Venice by Roberta, which I don't know if it's directly inspired by The Merchant of Venice, but I was always, didn't want to read this in case it spoiled The Merchant of Venice for me. It does sound like it's also about a Jewish woman who is working as a midwife in Venice at the same time period in the 16th century. So I think this would be a nice companion read to The Merchant of Venice, and I'm hoping to probably get to that in April to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday, of course. Second to last on my list of classics I want to read in 2021, we have The Confessions by St. Augustine. This is another one that is somewhat giant that I'm intimidated by and have started and failed to finish in the past, which we see as a recurring trend here with some of the other books I've chosen. This is considered a spiritual classic written by St. Augustine, who is a North African man living in the 300s and 400s in what is now modern-day Algeria, and at the time was part of the Roman Empire in North Africa. I've seen so many beautiful quotes from this book that I really do want to read it. It's considered one of the first autobiographies ever written, and it tells Augustine's conversion story and how he came to find faith later in life. Last but not least on my list, I have an either-or, and that is either Villette or The Professor, or hopefully both, depending on how my reading year goes, and both of those are by Charlotte Bronte. And Villette and The Professor are the last two books I have to finish off the Bronte canon, so that's a goal that I definitely am hoping to achieve in the near future. So if I could get to both this year, that would be fantastic, and if I only get to one, I will also be happy with that. I feel like Charlotte Bronte has been a little bit hit and miss for me. In the other books of hers that I've read, I have really enjoyed some parts and then found other parts to be quite a slog. So I am looking forward to reading her other two books to see if maybe I'll find a new favorite of hers in either Villette or The Professor. So The Professor is significantly shorter than Villette, so it might be that I choose The Professor since I have some other lengthy books on my Classics TBR for the year, but either way I'm hoping to finish one if not both of those in 2021. So those are the 12 classics that I'm hoping to get to in 2021, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book.